The sound of Paul's voice cut through the noise of clinking dishes, sharp and demanding. "Janet, bring me some tea."
"Now?"
I froze, my hands still in the soapy water. "Hold on," I said quietly, trying to keep my tone steady. "I'm doing the dishes." His voice dripped with disbelief and impatience. "Stop that, and bring me the tea."
"Now."
"Can't you follow simple orders?" I opened my mouth, trying to respond, but before I could say anything, he interrupted. "What a useless wife you are." Just then, I heard another voice from the living room. "Make me some sweet coffee," my mother-in-law, Mrs. Lauren, called out. She was sitting on the couch, eating a slice of cake she had taken from the fridge. Her eyes held a sharp, unkind look that made me feel small. I sighed and looked at the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. There were so many. I felt tired, worn down, but still, I nodded and turned to get the tea and coffee. "Leave the dishes for later," Mrs. Lauren sneered. "Just do what we tell you." Useless wife. Paul's words echoed through the kitchen, each one feeling like a whip. "My name is Janet, and I'm 31 years old. I'm a working mother, and yet, I feel like I am trapped. This house is supposed to be my home, but it feels more like a cage. I got married when I was 25, hoping for love, kindness, and companionship. Instead, I ended up with Paul and his demanding mother. My only happiness comes from our little boy, who is 5 years old. He is my light in this dark, joyless place. We live in Paul's parents' house. It wasn't my choice. I was told we needed to be here to look after Mrs. Lauren after her husband passed away. At first, I felt sorry for her. I believed she was mourning, that she needed family around. But soon, I realized she had no real grief. She only wanted someone to control, to order around. She wanted someone to treat as a servant, and that someone was me. Every day is the same. I cook, clean, work, and try to keep up with their endless demands, but it's never enough. If I make a meal, they criticize it. "The stir-fry is so poorly made," Mrs. Lauren would say with disgust. "Make it from scratch, like you're supposed to." I would try to respond politely. "I'm busy, so I can only make simple things." She would snap back with a cold tone. I hate backtalk from my daughter-in-law. Cook it from scratch. One day, I finally dared to ask her, "Why don't you cook if you're such a good cook?" Her response was cold and dismissive. "Why should I do housework when you're here?" she sneered, making it clear that she considered me her personal servant. Over the years, their cruelty has only grown worse. When they weren't scolding me, they ignored me completely. It was like I was invisible, a ghost in my own life. 6 years have passed in this suffocating atmosphere. Now I am 31, and Paul is 35. Our son is growing, but the air in this house remains heavy and oppressive. Mrs. Lauren is now 66, and she seems to take pleasure in watching me struggle. One evening, after a long day of work, I walked home, exhausted and weighed down by a painful realization. In this house, to these people, my existence seemed meaningless. I felt like a shadow in my own home, unseen and unheard. The only person who truly noticed me was my son, and the thought of losing even his small recognition was too painful to bear. When I came home that evening, I tried to push away the sadness by focusing on dinner. I got busy in the kitchen, making mapo tofu, fried chicken, and a stir-fry with bell peppers and pork. I hoped a nice meal would bring some peace to the house, some sense of normalcy. Suddenly, Paul's voice cut through the quiet, breaking a long silence. "Bring me the mayo." "Sure, here you go," I replied, handing him the mayonnaise. These were his first words to me in ages, and they weren't kind or grateful, just another command. That small, simple moment felt like the last straw for me. It was the final test of my patience, and I felt something inside me snap. Things only got worse that evening. As we started to eat, Mrs. Lauren spoke up.
"Clean the toilet," she demanded.
"Right now?" I asked in disbelief, feeling a wave of anger rising inside. "Yes, now," she insisted, her voice laced with coldness. She didn't care that we were in the middle of dinner.
It was just another way to control me, to show her power.
I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Don't say such a thing while we're eating," I snapped. It's nasty, just like your heart. Her face twisted with anger, and soon, we were in a heated argument. Paul jumped in, siding with his mother, and demanded I apologize to her. But for the first time in years, I stood my ground. I refused to back down, and in that moment, a deep realization hit me. I needed to escape this toxic environment. Not only for myself, but for my son, who deserved better than this. I retreated to my room, my mind made up. I went online, downloaded divorce papers, filled them out, and marched back into the living room. I slammed the papers down in front of Paul. His face showed pure shock, but I felt only a cold sense of determination. "I'm filing these," I said, my voice steady and calm. Standing there, looking at my husband's stunned face, I realized that I had finally stepped out of the shadows. I was ready to reclaim my life. The days that followed were tense, filled with cold glares and biting comments. Mrs. Lauren looked at me with even more disdain, and Paul threw sarcastic remarks my way. But amidst all the chaos, I felt a strange new sense of freedom. One evening, as I served dinner, Mrs. Lauren sneered, "You call this food? Even a child could cook better." Ignoring her, I focused on my son's happy face. "Eat up, sweetheart," I said gently. "I made your favorite tonight." Paul chimed in with a mocking tone. "Oh, playing the perfect mother now, are we? What a joke." I felt the anger rising but kept my calm. "I'm just trying to make a nice dinner for our son." Mrs. Lauren scoffed. "Don't act so high and mighty. You're just a burden in this house." Paul added, "So, Janet, have you thought about how you'll survive after the divorce? You can barely keep a house, let alone your own life." I looked him straight in the eye, feeling a newfound strength within me. I was no longer that shadow, and I was ready to face whatever came next. I had been supporting this family for years, working hard and managing most of the household expenses. I looked straight at Paul and said, "I'm not worried about taking care of myself and our son." I saw his confident smirk fade slightly as a flicker of unease crossed his face. Mrs. Lauren jumped in quickly. "A plan? Don't be ridiculous. You need us more than we need you," she scoffed, her words filled with disdain. The conversation shifted to money, a topic they usually avoided. "You both know that without my salary, this household would struggle," I stated, partly to remind myself of my own value. Mrs. Lauren dismissed me with a wave. "We'll manage just fine. We don't need your pity money," she sneered. But Paul was silent. He knew the truth, that without my income, they would be in serious trouble. In the days that followed, their behavior became strange and unpredictable. Mrs. Lauren would switch between acting sweet and then throwing insults if I didn't do as she pleased. Paul, meanwhile, looked lost, his arrogance fading as he began to realize just how much they depended on me financially. One afternoon, I accidentally overheard them talking. Paul was upset. "She can't leave us like this," he hissed. "We need her money." Mrs. Lauren's reply was cold and calculated. "Don't worry, I have a plan. We'll make her life so miserable, she won't dare to leave." Hearing their true intentions hit me like a cold wave. They didn't care about me, or even about our son. It was all about control and money. That night, as I lay in bed, a plan started forming in my mind. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one. But I wouldn't waste my energy on pointless arguments. I would hit them where it hurt the most, their pride and their pockets. The next morning, I began taking steps to protect myself and my future. I contacted a lawyer, a tough, smart woman who came highly recommended. "I want a divorce," I told her firmly, "and I want to make sure they don't get a penny more than they deserve." She nodded with a determined look. "We'll make sure of that. You've been the main provider, right? That will work in your favor." Over the next few days, I felt my resolve grow stronger. I started documenting everything, the insults, the manipulation, and every small way they tried to control me. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. For the first time in years, I felt empowered, like I was finally in control of my life. The shadows that had hung over me for so long were beginning to lift, and I felt the promise of a new beginning. When the divorce proceedings started, the atmosphere in the house grew more toxic. But each day, my fear lessened, replaced by a fierce determination. One evening, Mrs. Lauren tried a different tactic. "Janet, dear," she began in a sugary tone, "why don't we forget about all this unpleasant business? You know we're family." But her words felt empty, dripping with insincerity. I had seen her true intentions, and I knew that no amount of sweet talk could erase the years of mistreatment. I was ready to break free and start anew, for myself and for my son. The time for living in fear and shadows was over. I looked straight into Mrs. Lauren's eyes, firm and unafraid. "Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me," I said, keeping my voice steady. Paul, who had been quietly watching, scoffed. "Oh, playing the victim now? You're not as innocent as you pretend to be." I felt a rush of anger, but kept my calm. "I'm not playing anything, Paul. I'm just done being your scapegoat." As usual, the conversation shifted to finances. Paul sneered. "You think you can just take our son and leave? How will you support him?" I let a small, confident smile cross my face. "I've been supporting this family for years. I know I can manage." Mrs. Lauren's expression twisted into a sneer. "You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back." But their words no longer had any power over me. I knew my own worth now, and I knew the truth. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. She explained the plan clearly. "We'll show the court how financially dependent they are on you. This will help in the custody case and division of assets." I nodded, feeling a sense of justice. The law was on my side, and I was ready to stand up for myself. At home, the tension was at its highest. Mrs. Lauren's attempts to put me down grew desperate. One evening, she spat. "You think you're so smart, but you're just a cold-hearted woman abandoning her family." I looked her straight in the eye.
No.
"I'm a woman who's finally standing up for herself." Paul joined in, his voice full of anger. "You'll regret this. You can't survive without me." But his threats didn't scare me anymore. I was done being intimidated. Over the next few days, I focused on preparing for the court case. I gathered financial records, recorded their abusive comments, and documented every instance of their neglect. One afternoon, as I was organizing my papers, my son came up to me. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" he asked in a small, uncertain voice. I hugged him tightly, feeling a wave of protectiveness.
"Yes, sweetheart.
"We're going to be just fine. We're leaving here, and we're going to start a new, happy life. Just you and me." His little arms tightened around me, and I knew I was making the right choice. I was fighting not just for myself, but for my son's future. As the court date drew closer, I felt a mix of fear and relief. This was my chance to finally break free from their control and give my son the peaceful life he deserved. I was ready to end their cycle of emotional abuse and take back my life. When the day of the court hearing arrived, I felt a surge of determination. This was the moment I had been preparing for. I was ready to face Paul and Mrs. Lauren, to end their control once and for all. I was determined to seek justice, to reclaim my life, and to give my son a future filled with happiness and peace. I sat across from Paul and Mrs. Lauren in the courtroom, feeling like I was in a dream. This was the moment when everything in my life would change. The judge began the proceedings, and there was a serious, formal atmosphere. Paul's lawyer spoke first, describing him as a caring husband and father who is suffering from false accusations. Mrs. Lauren pretended to be the poor mother-in-law, hurt by her ungrateful daughter-in-law. But their performance seemed fake and shallow, like they were putting on a show. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath and kept my voice steady. I have been the main provider for this family for years. My husband's lack of work and his mother's constant manipulation have caused a lot of stress. Paul interrupted, trying to sound hurt. "Janet, how can you say these things? I've always supported you." I looked him in the eye. "Support is more than just words, Paul. It's about actions, and your actions have only shown selfishness and cruelty." The judge listened carefully as I shared my evidence. I had financial records, recordings of the harsh things they'd said to me, and statements from neighbors who had seen how they treated me. The truth was there for everyone to see, and as the evidence grew, Paul's fake kindness started to disappear. Mrs. Lauren's calm look faded, showing her real feelings underneath. Then came the part that sealed everything. My lawyer presented photos and documents proving Paul's infidelity and Mrs. Lauren's secret relationship with a wealthy neighbor, Mr. Jacob. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as these photos were shown, revealing them in situations that clearly showed their deceit. Their lies were finally out in the open. Paul's face turned pale, his eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Lauren's expression shifted from anger to panic, her hands shaking. You invaded our privacy," she shouted, her voice high and sharp. I looked at her, my voice steady. "No, I revealed the truth, a truth you both have been hiding for too long." The judge called for order in the court, but it was too late. Their carefully built stories were destroyed, their lies fully exposed. When the hearing ended, the judge made the decision. I was granted full custody of our son, and a fair division of our belongings was ordered. Paul and Mrs. Lauren were left with almost nothing but their broken reputations. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. Years of manipulation and emotional pain were finally behind me. I had faced my fears and won. The best moment came when my son ran into my arms outside the courthouse, his face filled with happiness and relief. "We did it, Mom," he said, his voice full of joy. "Yes, we did," I replied, holding him close. "We're free now. This is a new beginning for us." Hand in hand, we walked away, ready to start our fresh, happy life together. I realized that this victory wasn't just mine. It was for anyone who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, or unworthy. This was a win for truth and justice. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and a brighter future. After the court ruling, word of Paul and Mrs. Lauren's lies and betrayals spread quickly through our small community. Their reputations were shattered, and they could no longer pretend to be respectable. People saw them for who they really were. In the days following the court's decision, I focused on rebuilding my life with my son. Still, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that Paul and Mrs. Lauren were finally facing the consequences of their actions. I felt a deep sense of peace as I moved forward, knowing they were no longer able to control or hurt me. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, I heard a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Jacob, the wife of the man Mrs. Lauren had been secretly seeing. Her eyes were red from crying. "Janet, I heard about everything," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't believe what Mrs. Lauren did to you, and to me." I invited her in and made us both a cup of tea. As we sat at the kitchen table, she opened up, sharing her pain and heartbreak. "I trusted her," she whispered. "She was my neighbor, my friend, and all this time, she was betraying me." I listened, offering her comfort. It became clear that Mrs. Lauren's actions had hurt more than just me. They had destroyed the trust and friendships she had taken for granted. The next day, I ran into Paul while I was out in town. He looked nothing like the confident man he used to be. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a sad, defeated look. "Janet, please, can we talk?" he asked softly, barely able to meet my eyes. I stopped and looked at him. "What is there to talk about, Paul?" He shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't realize how much I depended on you, on your strength." His apology, though late, showed me how much had changed. He had lost everything, his pride, his family, and his home. Only now did he seem to understand his mistakes. But his regret didn't change anything for me. I had moved on. Mrs. Lauren, however, was facing the hardest consequences. Her affair with Mr. Jacob had destroyed her reputation and even led to legal trouble. Mrs. Jacob had filed for divorce and was also suing her for alienation of affection, a lawsuit claiming Mrs. Lauren had interfered in her marriage. Neighbors gossiped about Mrs. Lauren's downfall, whispering about the proud woman who had now become an outcast. She was shunned by the very people who once called her a friend. Her actions had finally caught up with her, and she had no one to turn to. This journey had been difficult, but as I watched Paul and Mrs. Lauren face the results of their own choices, I felt nothing but relief. I knew I had made the right decision, not just for myself, but for my son. This new chapter was ours to write, and I was ready to fill it with peace, strength, and joy. I saw her at the grocery store, rushing through the aisles with her eyes cast down. She looked tired, defeated. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Her face twisted with anger as she passed by, and she muttered under her breath, "You did this to me." I watched her walk away, feeling a mix of pity and satisfaction. "No, Julie," I whispered to myself. "You did this to yourself." The wheels of justice had finally turned, and the consequences of her actions were now inescapable. Paul and Mrs. Lauren were living in the very mess they had created through years of lies and manipulation. Seeing them face the results of their choices was freeing. For so long, I had been caught up in their web, controlled by their words and actions. But now, as I watched them struggle, I felt a deep sense of peace. I realized that the best revenge wasn't anger or resentment. It was living well, free from their toxic influence. I turned my focus back to what really mattered, my son and our new life. Every day was a chance to rebuild, to create a life filled with joy and peace. I understood now that this wasn't just about revenge or seeing them fall. This was about freedom, breaking free from the chains of abuse, control, and fear. This journey had taught me strength and resilience. I had faced my fears, stood up to those who tried to belittle me, and I had won. But the real victory was the life I was now able to give my son. He deserved a home filled with love, safety, and kindness. And I was determined to give him that. As I looked to the future, I felt hopeful. I knew the best was yet to come. Free from the shadows of the past, I was ready to embrace a life of happiness and fulfillment. This was just the beginning, and I was excited for all that lay ahead.